This is a basic introduction to heredity and helping you to understand how we actually get the physical characteristics and unseen characteristics that we inherit from our parents. And it all started many years ago with a monk called Gregor Mendel. Now, he loved studying pea plants and spent many years selectively breeding pea plants to look at the different genetic combinations and the traits that arose in the offspring. Now, he noticed a few things. He realized that traits were passed from parent to offspring, but some were more dominant than others. Some traits skipped generations. Here's a few of the things that Mendel noticed. First of all, we have here examples of characteristics, just like this, and their different versions, like this. Mendel noticed that we all have specific characteristics, but each of those characteristics can have many different versions depending on what it is. So, in the case of humans, we'll have a characteristic of skin color. There are many different versions or traits of skin color. And in his pea plants, he noticed that for each characteristic, there were several different traits that could present themselves. In the case of the form, you could have round or wrinkled. In the case of the cotyledons, you could have yellow or green. Color was white or purple. Form was full or constricted. The colour of the bean was yellow or green. The placement of the flowers was either axial or terminal, and the size was either tall or short pea plants. So you have a characteristic, which is the larger group there, like form or cotyledon or colour, and within that characteristic you have many different versions of it, and these versions are called traits. Now, these traits are very important because the question is, how can you have a characteristic with different traits? Mendel called them factors. He said there must be something that's passed on from parent to offspring to allow for different traits to appear. Now, it was a long time before Mendel's work was actually taken up again. It wasn't until the 1900s that scientists really took his findings seriously. And when they did, they started to notice a few other odd things. They noticed that in certain situations, you actually didn't have an obvious dominant or a recessive trait. So a dominant one is one that always shows, and a recessive is one that can be hidden. They also noticed that some traits tend to compete when you actually combine them. So this is a flower which is a combination of a white and a red flower, and in here we've actually got this dappled effect where you have both the red and the white characteristics or traits coming through. They noticed that some, when you combine them, came up with a completely different combination or trait. In this plant, when you combine the red and the white flowers, you end up with a pink one. So a completely new trait seemed to emerge. And lastly, they noticed that some hidden traits only appear on the male of the species and rarely in the females. So that's a very important relationship that they had to investigate further. Now we're just going to point out some of the important relationships that came from Mendel's observations and other scientists' observations. And the first one was from the observation Mendel had about some traits being more dominant than others and other traits skipping generations. Now, this is actually evidence of a dominant recessive relationship where one trait actually dominates over another. Now, the pattern that you see here when you actually do many crosses is this. If you crossed a purely dominant trait organism, so like a red flower, which he called true breeding flowers, so they'd been breeding generations of red only, and a true breeding white flower, where it was only white, cross them, and you ended up with 100% dominant traits. He called this his F1 generation, and he called this one the original generation P1 for parents. Then if he took two of the offspring from this F1 generation where they had 100% dominant trait and the recessive trait was somewhere hidden in them, was his theory, crossed them, he ended up getting 75% dominant trait coming out and 25% recessive trait showing in what he called his F2 generation. So there was a pattern here, a pattern of hiding a recessive trait and having it come back out when you breed subsequent generations, but in a definite mathematical pattern. Now the next relationship they found was one that they called codominance, and this is where you find two seemingly dominant traits competing in one organism. And this ended up with what we called a roan. So when we're breeding these ones, you would end up breeding one dominant trait, a true breeding one, so many generations breeding that true, say red flower, combined with another dominant trait like white flower, crossed with another dominant trait, to end up with a combination of both traits. Now, when you actually then combine these again, you ended up with the following effect. In your F1 generation, you will end up with 100% codominant traits showing. Now, if you then cross them again and get an F2 generation, you'll actually split the traits up in 50% of the offspring. 25 will be the first dominant trait, 50% will still be codominant, and 25% will be dominant of the second trait only. So this is the pattern that was found with what we call codominance. Then we had the observation that when you mix some traits, they'll actually make a new trait combined. So the pattern here is quite simple. When you combine trait 1 and 2, you get 100% of 1 and 2 combined in a new trait. We say that that's incomplete dominance. Now, they might have thought that they came up with a new trait, but when you actually breed again the F1 generation to make a new F2 generation, you end up getting those traits back. You end up getting 25% of trait 1, 25% purely trait 2, and 50% is a mixed or incomplete dominance showing through. And the last thing that they also noticed was that some traits only seem to appear on the male of a species and rarely in the female. This led scientists to believe that the traits must be closely together if they are related to sex. So they must be somehow recorded closely together so that when a sex is actually passed on to an organism, that trait is passed on with it.